This video is sponsored by Ren. I remitted debts and washed all hands of such obligations. For 7 days, no grain was ground. The slave girl was equal to her mistress, and the slave stood at his master's side. The orphan was not given over to the wealthy man. The widow was not given over to the powerful man. And in the house with no male heir, its daughter became its heir. These words were inscribed over 4,000 years ago on a statue of a great king who most of us know little about. His people called him Gudea, and he was the king of Lagash. In an age when most rulers identified themselves as being great warriors and measured that greatness by the number of lands conquered and people subjugated, Gudea saw himself as a simple shepherd tending his flock, the latter being a metaphor for the people of Lagash. In the centuries before Gudea's reign, most of the kings of old, whether they deserved it or not, awarded themselves with lofty titles, such as Lugal, meaning great man, or more bombastic ones, such as King of the Four Quarters of the World, or King of the Universe. Though he was also a king, Gudea simply referred to himself as Ensi, which was the term used for a governor or other representative subordinate to a more powerful person. And yet, Gudea may have been one of the most influential people in the history of the ancient Near East. Before we continue, I'd like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Ren. These days, we hear a lot about the climate crisis, but realistically, it can be difficult to limit one's carbon footprint in a practical way. Enter Ren, a website where you can calculate your carbon footprint and then offset it by funding a diverse mix of carbon reduction projects, like tree planting, mineral weathering, and rainforest protection. By answering a few questions about your lifestyle, you can find out your carbon footprint and how to reduce it. There are several projects that you can get involved with, and when you make a monthly contribution, you'll receive updates from the projects you support and see exactly how your money is spent, with photos and details on every tree planted, every acre reforested, every ton of carbon offset, and so on. Living in California and personally being affected by wildfires, I'm a fan of the new Biochar in California project, but you can pick from a list of several others, such as community tree planting, to mineral weathering in Scotland, or helping to limit the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest. If you'd like to learn more, then check out the site ren.co. The first 100 people who sign up using the link in the video description will have 10 extra trees planted in their name. Limit your carbon footprint by checking out Ren today. Before we get into the life of Gudea, let's do a quick recap on the history of the region until his reign. For roughly the millennium between 3300 to 2300 BC, what we today know as Sumerian culture reigned supreme throughout much of Mesopotamia, especially in the south. The people who we call the Sumerians are credited by archaeologists and historians as being the first people to live in large urban spaces and to have invented writing, let alone many other innovations and contributions to mankind. Though their land of Sumer consisted of several independent and often competing city-states, the Sumerians shared a common language, culture, and religion. However, around 2330 BC, a man named Sargon, whose mother tongue was a language called Akkadian, conquered the entire region of Sumer and many of the lands beyond. These Akkadians, who came from the land just north of Sumer, called Akkad, didn't so much replace Sumerian civilization as merge with and build upon it. However, Akkadian did become the official language of the realm, and within a few generations, the common language amongst what was once the Sumerian-speaking population. Once great and independent cities such as Lagash, Ur, and Uruk were now all parts of a greater Akkadian empire. After less than 150 years, the Akkadian empire that Sargon of Akkad had founded collapsed, and we're told in later texts that society in Mesopotamia broke down, resulting in anarchy throughout the land. Though there may have been several causes for this, later generations would blame a primitive, mountain people from the east known as the Guteans for the political fragmentation and societal breakdown of the lands of Sumer and Akkad. How much actual power the Guteans had is hotly debated among scholars, but archaeological evidence does indicate that in the once glorious city-states of Sumer, there was economic and cultural stagnation. An exception was in the kingdom of Lagash, a state that was actually made up of 3 cities: Ningirsu, which was the capital and main religious center; Lagash, probably the largest city within the realm and from which the kingdom took its name, and a third, smaller city called Ningirsu. Shortly after the fall of the Akkadian Empire, commerce seems to have resumed in Lagash, and while other parts of Mesopotamia may have been under Gutean authority, Lagash seems to have had quite a bit of autonomy, if not outright independence, from any foreign rule. Though exact dates are debated and difficult to come by, around 2040 BC, a man named Gudea became the king of Lagash. He was not the son, but the son-in-law of his predecessor, Urbau. Though it's not expressly stated anywhere, Urbau probably didn't have a son who could succeed him as king, and so Gudea, who was married to his daughter, was the next best, or perhaps the most legitimate contender for the throne. It's not exactly known who Gudea's father was, but it's likely that he wasn't a king. He may have been some high government official or even a governor within Lagash, a position which Gudea may have eventually taken over. This might be why Gudea, even when he was a king, continued to use the title of Ensi when referring to himself, and not the greater title of Lugal, which most Sumerian kings took. Or it could have been, as many believe, that he considered himself to be the Ensi of a higher power, in this case, the patron deity of Lagash, the god Ningirsu. Gudea was extremely pious, and during his reign, he built and restored numerous shrines and temples dedicated to the various deities of Sumer. However, his most defining achievement, at least from his own inscriptions, occurred during his 4th year as king. This was the reconstruction of the Ininnu, which was the main temple of the god Ningirsu. The original structure had been badly damaged, if not totally destroyed, around 2340 BC by the king of the neighboring city of Umma, Lugal-Zaghazi. While by Gudea's time it had been somewhat rebuilt, the temple was a mere shadow of its former self. The story goes that Gudea was told in a dream to restore the temple of Ningirsu back to its former glory. Being the extremely pious man that he was, Gudea got to work. An inscription on one of his many statues tells us the following. Gudea, the ruler of Lagash, the righteous man who loves his god, had built the Ininnu for his king, Ningirsu. A ruler had never built a temple fashioned in this manner for Ningirsu, but he, Gudea, surely did build it. He inscribed his name on the temple, made the long and important things of the temple shine in their splendor, and acted faithfully on the word of Ningirsu. We're told many of the specifics with regard to the Ininnu's construction from inscriptions on several statues, as well as 2 large clay cylinders that were discovered at the site of Girsu. The inscriptions on the cylinders are the longest known Sumerian language texts to have ever been discovered. According to these sources, the very best materials from all over the known world were sought out and brought to Lagash. No expense was spared. Materials, though, were not enough. The new temple had to be consecrated in the purest of environments. Basically, the city had to be purified of evil, sickness, and disease before construction. A passage from one of Gudea's inscriptions describes this process. The impure man who is frightening, the man inflamed with venereal disease, and the woman in her impure birth period went out of the city. He built the temple of Ningirsu in a pure place, like Eridu. Whip did not crack, lash did not strike, and no mother struck her child. In the city cemetery, no corpse was brought there, no cult singer brought his harp there, and no mourner wailed in lament. Within the boundaries of Lagash, no one who had a legal complaint brought another man to the tribunal, and no collector entered another man's house. Another inscription reads, "He purified the holy city and encircled it with fires. He collected clay in a very pure place. In a pure place he made silt into bricks and put the bricks into the mold. He followed the rites in all their splendor. He purified the foundations of the temple, surrounded it with fires, and anointed the platform with an aromatic balm." Texts like these are invaluable to our understanding of the complicated rites that were carried out before the construction of a temple in ancient Mesopotamia. Once the city of Girsu was ritually purified, construction could begin. Gudea tells us that the materials came from all over the then known world. Cedar from what's today Lebanon, ebony wood and gold from the land of Meluha, which we today believe was within the confines of the Indus Valley civilization, and a variety of stone from places as far away as Syria and modern Oman. Referring to himself in the third person, Gudea tells us, "From the Amanus, the mountain range of cedars, he, Gudea, fashioned those cedars into great doors, decorated them with precious metal flowers, and brought them all into the Ininnu. He used the logs as roof beams for the lofty temple. He brought ebony wood from the land of Meluha, and also brought blocks of halalu stones from there. He brought gold ore from the mountain range of Hahum. He brought oak wood from Gubin, and a massive amount of bitumen from Madga. He brought diorite stone from Magan." The list of places, both known and unknown, as well as the materials acquired from them, goes on and on. Most of these items were not just exotic, but extremely expensive. Unfortunately, very little remains of what was once believed to have been the Ininnu, and so archaeologists can't really confirm all of the materials that were utilized in its construction. But assuming that Gudea's inscriptions are indeed true, then it gives us an idea of just how wealthy Lagash must have been, as well as the extent of its trade networks and contacts with other parts of the world. Such connections are not recorded anywhere else during the century or so between the fall of the Akkadian Empire and the supposed Gutian domination of much of Mesopotamia. The fact that a grand project like the construction of the Ininnu was going on in Lagash indicates that Gudea had either obtained special privileges from the Gutians, or, most likely, was independent of them. It's also possible that the Gutians actually feared an armed conflict with Gudea, and may have left Lagash and its territories alone. There's actually some evidence that might support this. In many of the same inscriptions where Gudea is recalling the acquisition of materials for the Ininnu, he also mentions successful military campaigns in neighboring Elam. One text tells us, "He struck the cities of Anshan and Elam with weapons, and brought their spoil into the Ininnu for Ningirsu." On the day when Gudea, the ruler of Lagash, had finished building the Ininnu for Ningirsu, he made the spoils a permanent donation to the temple. This doesn't mean that he literally attacked the well-fortified city of Anshan, which was deep in Elam, but probably those Elamite cities and towns closer to Lagash that were under Anshanite jurisdiction. In those days, Anshan was the main political and cultural center of Elam. So far, we've mostly focused on the construction of the Ininnu and his piety, but it's also worth noting that Gudea was a great patron of the arts and sought to bring Sumerian language and culture back to the forefront of society. He essentially sowed the seeds of what would soon blossom into a sort of Sumerian Renaissance. After Gudea's death, sometime between 2025 and 2020 BC, he was succeeded by his son, Ningirsu. His rule was quite short, for within a decade, Gudea's grandson, Ugmi, became king. Ugmi probably didn't have any offspring of his own, or at least none that were of age, and so the next to become king of Lagash was Urgar, one of Urbao's son-in-laws. Remember, Gudea was married to Urbao's daughter, and it's through her that he became king. Urbao seems to have had many daughters, because Urgar was succeeded by another one of his son-in-laws named Namhani. Sometime during the short reigns of Lagash's last kings, a man from Uruk named Utuhegal was able to successfully lead a Sumerian force to kick the Gutians out of Sumer. Utuhegal was a contemporary of Gudea, and may have even seen the Ininnu. There's little doubt, though, that his son-in-law and successor, Ur-Nammu, who founded the third dynasty of Ur, did see it, for it was during his reign that Lagash was absorbed into the now ascendant Neo-Sumerian Empire, whose capital was the city of Ur. Perhaps in an effort to outdo Gudea, as well as to visibly proclaim his city's domination over the region, Ur-Nammu built perhaps one of the greatest religious structures of the ancient world, the Great Ziggurat of Ur, which was dedicated to the moon god, Nana. It's also very likely that he and his successors adopted Gudea's model of kingship and the view that the ruler looked after his people in the same way that a shepherd cared for and looked after his flock. Perhaps without Gudea, there would be no Neo-Sumerian Empire, let alone a revival, even if short, of Sumerian language and culture under the patronage of the third dynasty of Ur. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. I hope that you enjoyed this look at one of the ancient world's most remarkable and underrated individuals. There's lots more on the way, so make sure that you're subscribed, and thanks for watching. I'd also really like to thank Grenkek69, Jaap de Graaf, Pasta Frola, Michael Lewis, Danielle Allen, Danny Van Eck, YNXTV, Robert Morgan, Frank, Tim Lane, Sebastian Hurtado Correa, Michael Trudell, Franz Robbins, Brendan Redman, Faridun Dadachanji, Jimmy Daruwala, Sher Cam, Farhad Kama, and all of the channel's patrons on Patreon for helping to support this and all future content. Check out the benefits to being a Patreon member, and if you'd like to join, feel free to click the link in the video description. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as continue to listen to special audio programs on the History with Sai podcast. Thanks again, and stay safe.